Hello everyone and welcome to another session of the Left Book Club's Anticapitalism series with Gargi Bhattacharya. Tonight we'll be discussing anti-capitalism and work with some incredible speakers all under one virtual roof. So we're really happy to have all of you join us today. My name's Elif and I work with the Left Book Club on events and political education. And just to say a little bit about the Left Book Club, we're a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Left Book Club events have featured some phenomenal speakers over the months, so please feel free to check out our library on YouTube for discussions engaging with a wide range of political thought. And tonight, I will remind you a few times, but tonight, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat, and there'll definitely be some time for our speakers to answer them at the end. And if you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member. Don't forget to follow them on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our events, promotions, and giveaways. Before I introduce the event tonight, I just thought it wouldn't make sense to ignore what's happening around the world tonight, these days, and particularly the past week, and particularly a discussion about work, class, and capital, of course, can't ignore what's been happening. And so from freedom fighters resisting against Turkish state fascism, invasion and occupation of Kurdistan, to the resistance in Palestine for existence against settler colonialism, to those fighting for democracy and freedom in Colombia, to women struggling against systemic feminicide, to looming climate catastrophe and struggles against the expansion of police and state powers all around the world. It's clear that the capitalist state is on a new offensive to firstly save itself from itself and to crush out any alternative and stamp the rest of the 21st century with the mark that even if it's bad, this is all you've got. And crucially, that this is all that's possible. So I want to take this opportunity before I introduce this incredible event tonight to say that internationalist solidarity and a common struggle perspective is way more powerful than we often imagine. And again, I want to salute all struggling, resisting, and fighting peoples all around the world for a free world. And actually, even more importantly, perhaps for the left, I unequivocally believe in the victory of these struggles. So for our May event of our popular anti-capitalism series with Gargi Bhattacharya, we're discussing work and its relation to how we organize life. And so we have Gargi, Vijay, Prashad, Dalia, Gebrial, and Amelia Horgan to discuss the work revolution that we so desperately need. So Gargi Bhattacharya is one of the UK's leading scholars on race and capitalism. She is the author of Rethinking Racial Capitalism, Dangerous Brown Men, Traffic, and co-author of Empire's Endgame. Dalia Gebrial is a PhD candidate at LSE looking at race and the digital economy. She is also an associate contributor at Novara Media and co-author of Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State. Vijay Prashad is the director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, chief correspondent for Globetrotter, and chief editor at Left Word Books. His most recent book is Washington Bullets, with a preface from Evo Morales-Aymar. Amelia Horgan is a writer and researcher from London. She is interested in contemporary work practices and the philosophy of work. Her first book, Lost in Work, Escaping Capitalism, is out with Pluto Press this June. So definitely make sure you order that when it's out. Or I don't know, maybe when Amelia speaks, she can mention whether it's available for pre-order. She is currently writing a PhD on the politics of work at the University of Essex. So yeah, without further ado, over to you, Gargi.
Thanks so much, Elif, and thanks also for, I don't think any of us need reminding that, terrible and yet uncertain times and uncertain ways about the ways forward. I was having a conversation with my older child who's 15 in the car, and a few weeks ago we'd had a conversation about him saying, why do you bother doing international solidarity? How can things ever change in Palestine? And I said, well, I know it feels like that, but in my youth, people would say that about the South African struggle. And South Africans would come and say, this feels like it's immovable, but wait, when it comes to the end, it will just come almost that you won't realize that something is unraveling about this instance of empire. And actually today in the car, my 15-year-old said to me, perhaps you're right, maybe this moment is the moment. Look at the extent of solidarity of Palestine, the spread of it, of what the excess of the Zionist state's violence is in everyone's eyes. And so I think, you know, solidarity, but also hope and continuity, because, you know, sometimes we despair from afar, and that's not good enough, is it? People are giving their lives. We at least need to keep on. And so I hope I'll see lots of you in the streets, not only on Zoom, but for now on Zoom, another exciting Zoom event. And we've been waiting for this one. All of them we wait for, but this one felt like, oh, can we talk about work in a way that isn't quite the same as sometimes May events about work are? Not that we're not going to celebrate things about worker organisation, but also be a bit mixed up and kind of critical and imaginative, and just think about some of the side stories about work. Because people who've been before will know that in this session, we like to say, if you feel the world is not good enough, you can come and listen and learn with us. We don't expect you to have a pre-existing position. We're not doctrinal. Any element of the left, or even not the left, if you think capitalism has to go, come and talk to us. If you've not read the books yet, you can start by being in this space, because we'll have the conversation. Maybe you'll read the books later, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll decide that you go straight for the street fighting. Both of those things are fine. But, you know, it's like a kind of open forum and kind of virtual hug for all of us who wish for more for ourselves and for each other. So today, work, you know, there's a big word on the left that's been one of the ones that has shaped our history really possibly forever. Maybe that's the one that is, you know, the making of our binary between us and them. And of course, across anti-capitalist visions, whatever tradition that you're working in, or if you're not working in a tradition, work still is one of those tricky sites where capitalism really makes and remakes our lives. And it's quite, there's plenty of, my mother is calling me. She doesn't know I'm on. Sorry about that. Put her away now. Even though we often think in this space about all of the other ways in which people organize, there is still something about working life which is so central to how capitalism regulates our time, steals our time, shapes our domestic arrangements, makes our whole life seem as if it's about servicing the machine of capital. Work is the vehicle for that. So it's still, even if many leftists now don't particularly come through politicization through the workplace is still one of those key sites. And of course, historically, and not just historically, again and everywhere, worker organization is one of those central planks of resistance to capitalism. And certainly in Britain, we're seeing a real renewed energy in worker organization. I think we see parallels in lots of places, a kind of renewed energy in worker organization that moves from workplaces into the streets and back again, that mobilizes across workplace organization, community organization, that looks at what precarity means in the workplace and extends it to issues like immigration precarity and other kinds of forms of violence. And that's a kind of unstoppable fire about workers' movements, which we're kind of seeing come back again. In this moment, which is such a harsh moment, there's a kind of these eruptions of organization, some of which have come up very quickly, not necessarily from long-standing organizations, some which have been a real notable generational renewal of very long-standing organizations, but all kind of something about making the resistance again in all directions. All of my family coming in, sorry. Yes, you should have a burger. Sorry. You see what I'm saying? But I think for some of us, especially I find often amongst younger comrades in Britain, workplace organisation might seem somewhat unfamiliar. It feels like that's old bloke stuff. That the ways in which workplace organisation has been talked about, who owns the spaces of organisation, what the vehicles of organisation are, because there has been a very institutionalised labour movement, that somehow that hasn't always touched new generations in the same way, perhaps never really touched minoritised communities or women or lower paid workers, outsourced workers in the same way. And for some others, and I really have sympathy with this, even though I'm absolutely terribly institutionalized in the mainstream trade union movement, I really understand why for some others, trade unions and even workers' parties are regarded as too bureaucratically institutional to really tackle the nature of the capitalist beast before us. But there's kind of thing of like, well, I could do this, but it's all about rules and tiny changes. And look, capital is killing us. Capital is COVID neglect. As Elif has said, capital is a repressive state that will come to your street with weaponry. In the face of that, how is that kind of slow-moving bureaucratic machine of mainstream trade unions or some of the most established workers' parties, how could that fit? So I hope that some of what we'll talk about today is like the impatience, necessary impatience of many, alongside what longer standing structures have been. At the same time, again, as I've said, because I'm built in the labour movement, grudgingly, bad-temperedly built with lots of kicking, but still built in that space, workplace resistance, I still think, is likely to be one of the most accessible vehicles of anti-capitalist activity for many. For lots of people, that's the first place you can do things with other people, learn something about what a collective voice, a collective agency might be, because you've got a shared enemy, you've got a space, you've got a structure to do it in, even in precaritized work. And even if people organize at work in the beginning, or even primarily to win small concessions from the employer, a break here, a limit on hours there, perhaps with no larger aspiration than to make work bearable. And I'd like to think about that as well, because I think the aspiration to make work bearable is a pretty central anti-capitalist demand. You know, if work is killing you, which again is happening across the world, the ways that we organise to make work livable again, even if it's not the whole journey, perhaps that is still part of how we shape our anti-capitalism. But even those small calls for concession, or the just staying alive model of worker organisation, also builds something different despite itself, doesn't it? That when we band together and exercise collective power, there's something, we've talked previously about different kinds of prefigurative politics, that becoming a collective agent, even if it's sometimes for very immediate goals, that's the kind of the seed, isn't it? That can go elsewhere. And that's partly what we're seeing with these eruptions of resistance. So despite the dullness of some elements of the labour movement, I think it's very difficult to imagine an anti-capitalist movement that doesn't include worker organisation and struggle as a central component, but perhaps not as the only component, which maybe is also a shift that we've been going through. Again, in my youth, most of the left that I was in touch with really acted as if the left was only a workers' movement. Other people can travel along, but they're not really part of it. I don't hear that as much now, and perhaps we'll talk about that relation between workers' organisation and other kinds of organisation. Perhaps we largely agree now that the global movement against capitalism must include many who are not strictly workers as well, or maybe not workers at all. But don't throw the infrastructure out with the bathwater. There's still something about our practices of workplace organisation, and even our party organisations in some places. It's hard to say that in Britain because you can't, don't even think about it. That's why I feel like, I don't want to say the Party of Labour, But of course, across the world, we have much more vibrant party machineries that still are in existence and have that connection between different elements of what the struggle might be. And that raises, I think, the challenge for us to think about how we can replicate that everywhere. How can we organise through work in ways that don't lead to further fragmentation amongst the working class? If capital makes us all different and says, oh, they're your enemies and you don't see them and you only work nights, what can we do to defragment, to collectivise again? And also, how can we build worker organisations that don't make people only go, oh, not another meeting, but are vibrant and welcoming and feel like this is the place I must be to stop my life being ruined by capital, which is the beginning point for all kind of capitalist, anti-capitalist engagement. So I feel like I've gone on a bit longer than I thought I would today. Sorry, obviously work is my weak point, but I'm going to move on to our first special guest. Amelia is going to go first, and we've already heard about her very exciting work. Do pre-order the book. I'm pretty certain you can.
Hi, thanks so much. You can pre-order it. I'm gonna try and make a couple of short points about politics at work and the way in which those might relate to anti-capitalism and the ways in which they might not. So I guess I want to present a puzzle. Lots of people are frustrated with work. They're frustrated with their managers. They're frustrated with their boss. They're frustrated with their commute. They're frustrated with, you know, all of these kind of daily indignities. But most of them are not anti-capitalists. How come? Why is that? How do we take those frustrations that people have, and how do we push those, and how do we build class consciousness around those? So yeah, lots of people are unhappy, but there are not enough anti-capitalists. So one example, there's a book by an influencer, Grace Beverley, which is about working hard and burnout and how to look after yourself at work, right? And fundamentally, more people are going to be buying that book and talking about that book than we'll be talking about my book, right? This is the reality of it. When people have a problem at work, what they tend to see is, how can I reshape my subjectivity? How can I look after myself better? How can I change what I'm doing to realign myself to better fit my workplace, rather than thinking, how can I change my workplace? What can I do to gain power? So how can we change that? How do we radicalize people's everyday griping? How do we join that up? I'm going to be mainly talking about, I guess, the thing that's taken for granted is the workplace. And it's not that I don't want to problematize that, but I think other people are going to be talking about that and will do a better job than I will. So this comes to the big caveat that the ordinary workplace, whether that's the office or the factory, is not the only workplace at all. So waged formal work is not the only place where work happens. Work can be in the home, it can be unwaged, it can be outside of that formal wage sector. And we might want to question whether even wage work takes place in that home, in that workplace itself, right? There's a blurring of work life and home life. So I'm not saying that this is the only kind of work at all, but I think we can think about how we can radicalize that kind of relation too. So it seems that on the face of it, work could make visible to us the relations of power and capitalism. And there's a reason for this. Because some people must work, they don't own the means of production. They must sell their time as labor power. This has a couple of points that come off of it. When you sell your time as labor power, right, you are giving kind of control, and that has a particular relationship that comes off of it. So your employer is going to be trying to get the most out of you in that time. You're not necessarily going to be wanting to give them the most, right? Because you know that after work you've got to go and see your friends, or you've got to look after your kids, or whatever it is, but you don't want to be giving the full amount of your effort at any given time. But that is what your manager acting on behalf of your boss, or your boss, is going to want to extract from you. So there is this kind of tug of war, and I think this is something that became very visible during the early pandemic, when it wasn't clear how safe returning to work would be, and lots of people perhaps assumed that their employer, you know, they see day in, day out, they might have considered as even kind of their friend in some way, or they might have been told, this is, you know, you're part of the family here. They were told, oh, you've got to come in. You've got to come in. Well, it might be dangerous, but the reality is, you know, money's got to be made. And I think that kind of showed that workplace relation as a relation of power in a way that it hadn't been before. But often these kind of things are hidden. But there is this tug of war that does become visible, especially in moments of crises. And that's a really important relationship. And this kind of tug of war is mediated by the law, right? And enforced by trade unions as well. So this is one of the areas where trade unions can like intervene, right? If you have an agreement that you do not do this thing, that's not, or your hours work this way, right? There's a way in which this kind of tug of war is intervened in by another organization. But often this power is exercised more subtly. It's not always the case that your employer is saying, come in on pain of, in the situation where your life is genuinely at risk. That is the reality for lots of people. It was during the pandemic, and it is in certain sectors and places. But most of the time, when you go into work, you're not being told to do things which obviously put you in danger. So what you're saying, I'm not going to do this, right? It's not, that relation is kind of hidden. And that's partly hidden by things in which you are made to feel that like meaning is accessible through work or personal fulfillment and these kind of things, right? And it's not that this is entirely untrue, right? People do find meaning in their work. But these are kind of, this human need for meaning, this human desire for meaning and sociability is kind of cannibalized, right? In the workplace in a way which hides this tug of war, this relation of power. And I guess one area we can see this is in contemporary worries about burnout. So there is this widespread worry that people are exhausted and have too much to do and can't really deal with it, right? And sometimes when this is discussed, it even relates to capitalism, but does so quite vaguely. There's a general feeling that it has something to do with work, but it's often presented as like an excess of care. People are caring too much about their job. It's kind of like depression, but for people who are professionally successful, right? But actually, burnout comes from, or this thing that people call burnout, has this material basis. It's not this free floating pathology which says like, you should be a workaholic. Like there is a material basis for this. And I think one way into trying to radicalize the problem of work is trying to say, look at these power relations. The reason that you're feeling so tired is not because you personally have decided, I'm going to, I want to be productive. I've got this work ethic, but to think, who does your work ethic benefit, right? Like what has happened there? So I think Kathy Weeks has some helpful things to say about this, that the work ethic is partly a way of sorting different kinds of workers. So you have these successful good workers, and then you have the suppression of wages who do not fall into wages of workers who do not fall into this group, who are lazy, who are not working hard enough, who just haven't done the right thing. But there's also what she's termed a motivational nexus, right? So you have this feeling that your productivity is deeply important to you, to your kind of like self-fulfillment, and this is drawn out of work. So people take on improvement as their own issue, something they should be doing. It's not merely enough anymore to like do your job, right? You can't go in and do what your contract says. You've got to be doing more. And who does this benefit? This doesn't necessarily benefit you. This is like a cheap way of getting continuous improvement from you. So I think there's a couple of problems with the current approach towards work. And one is that there's this really simplified meme version on the left of what we do about work, which just says, just join a union. Okay, obviously everyone should join a union. That should be the first thing you do whenever you get a job, right? You should be like, what is the union here? What should I do? But it's not really enough on its own. You need to like get involved. This is a really big problem. People are like, join a union, but it goes much further than that. But it's also not merely enough to say that. The changing nature of work means just like carrying on doing the same thing is not necessarily going to work. So we need to think about struggles that straddle kind of socially reproductive issues and work issues. We might think about kind of radicalizing time and free time. And it comes down to rather than just saying, just join a union, or like, we can just fix this with one quick trick, whether that's UBI or just having everyone join a union, is we need to actually build consciousness. And it's it's not enough just to be like, okay, everyone can just think their way out, right? Everyone can just stop being so productive. We need to think about how do we build these other durable sites of struggle, other durable sites of meaning. So I think this question of why do we hate work, but why are we not anti-capitalists, is because like work offers us this really rich sense of meaning, and we need to think about other sites we can get that. And it's not enough just to say, you know, join a union, job done. We need to really build that as a movement, I guess. I think that's all I've got to say in this bit, and I'm sure there'll be lots more in the question.
Thanks so much, Amelia. That was just lovely, and it also made written a note to myself about, you know, in praise of lazy workers, and maybe we should try and promote that amongst ourselves. Don't let my employer hear. Anyway, Dalia is going to join us next on the next bit. Thanks.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my friends, speaking to a lot of my friends who sort of do like more formal work than I do over the pandemic, people who aren't doing like key worker stuff, and they've just come up with these absolutely ingenious ways of like tricking their bosses into thinking that they're doing work when they're like someone who like literally made a software to like trick the tracking devices that are used to make sure that like he's moving his mouse regularly enough, things like that. So there's a very rich sort of you know, that I think there's like a lot of really hilarious and like really interesting stuff looking at sort of how especially people in, you know, what David Graeber would call bullshit jobs, what the pandemic has meant for them, I think has been really really interesting. But you know, speaking about the coronavirus crisis, I think, and I'm going to draw kind of on my work on platform labor and, you know, the gig economy, the digital gig economy specifically, and how it's kind of reconfiguring work in ways that are going to have, I think is going to have a lot of impact outside of what is currently being mediated through platforms. So to kind of contextualize it, the coronavirus crisis brought to head a set of many contradictions that have been corroding the rights and the conditions of workers, the working class, for decades. And it's contradictions to do with work and related concepts like worker and workplace and working time. And these concepts, I would say, have been taken for granted by the left as sort of stable and unifying categories of organization, but they are actually being strategically undermined by capital as part of its latest fix, especially in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And what this shows up as is that across the world, we're seeing this dramatic shrinkage in the proportion of people who are employed in full-time standard work. So as of 2019, 53%, this has probably changed dramatically in the past year, but 53% of the world's employed population are waged salaried workers. So that means just over half. And of that group, 40% rely on informal income streams to compensate for inadequate wages. And 470 million people worldwide are underutilized, which means they are precariously tethered to the world of employment. So they're not classified as unemployed, but their access to paid work is unpredictable and insufficient to sustain themselves and their families. So global underutilization really outweighs global unemployment in terms of scale. So the former affects about twice as many as the latter. And indeed, much of this is geographic. Many countries in the global south have both the highest employment to population and the highest underutilization ratios in the world. So that means that the global workforce is disproportionately concentrated in the global south, where the quality and the stability of work access is the worst. So basically that tells us that the employment and unemployment dichotomy that a lot of our public conversation on the economy and work has historically relied on is not the best indicator of whether or not people are able to maintain a materially decent life. And that rise in underutilization, which is mediated through sort of geographic and sociological divisions of labor, comes down to what Gargi in her book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism, describes as quote, the endless innovation of precarious activities that may or may not constitute work. So capital once promised this global integration into an industrial workforce, but instead it's maneuvered its way out of that pesky predicament of paying for a workforce, of providing workers with a reliable salary, with sick pay, pensions, basic means of life. And these maneuvers, they're legal, they're cultural, they're political, and they combine to undermine and destabilize that figure of the worker as both a political subjectivity and an analytical category. So the socioeconomic implications of that division between the worker and the sort of not quite worker or the sometimes worker couldn't have been starker than in Rishi Sunak's original coronavirus rescue package, which it covered 80% of employees' wages, but the initial package didn't even make reference to those who work but are not employed. And then following a lot of pressure from smaller unions and then Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, remember the good old days, Sunak finally outlined his plan for those who fall outside that traditional employee model, where furlough was a fairly simple transition. And it was a plan that was shockingly out of touch with the material realities of these workers' lives. So not only did it leave workers who overwhelmingly lived hand to mouth without wages for nearly 3 months, but it constructed a set of complex bureaucratic hoops through which already anxious workers had to jump. And it also excluded the many workers who billed their wages piecemeal from both employed and non-employed work. So this considerable proportion, which we're talking in sort of the UK specifically, a considerable proportion of the UK's workforce, not incidentally comprised predominantly of working class migrants, just didn't figure into its calculations of policymakers responsible for the economic response to the crisis. So if we're going to look at the workers who kind of fall between these cracks of employment protections, we can look at platform workers, so digital gig economy workers. So the most famous example would be like Uber, Deliveroo, but also this is also becoming an increasingly dominant model in care work, in domestic work, and healthcare and social care. So that kind of what makes up the gig economy is this like taskification where work is broken down into little tasks, some of which are compensated, some of which aren't. It's also a kind of a form of outsourcing as well. And it's been a key mechanism through which capitalism has accelerated and intensified the underutilization of swathes of the workforce. And these mechanisms are glossed over by the cultural story that these platforms and apps tell about themselves, which is that they offer worker flexibility, the opportunity to be an entrepreneur. But in reality, these workers are subject to the worst of both worlds, whereby they're not considered employees, but they're subject to a level of control and discipline that actually exceeds traditional employers most of the time. They have no centralized workplace, they're dispersed, they find it much more difficult to connect with one another, but also to conceive of themselves as part of a broader workforce, because remember, they're not encouraged to even see themselves as workers, but as their own boss. So the temporal and spatial boundaries between work and non-work is blurred, and much of the work is actually looking for work itself, and that is not compensated. So the composition of the workforces being undermined by platformization, by this kind of model of work, is not incidental. These workers are overwhelmingly migrant or racially minoritized. They tend to work in key urban social infrastructural sectors. They're the minicab drivers, the couriers, the cleaners, the carers, the sex workers, the invisibilized backbones of our cities. They're excluded from formal workforces and then pushed into urban centers, where they experience intense forms of structural violence, often racialized and mediated through institutions that exist outside of the workplace, but are kind of part of making up your experience in the workplace. So housing, policing, immigration enforcement. So race and migration here are really central to how the state and capital create boundaries, not only between the deserving and undeserving poor, but the deserving and the undeserving worker, you know, the real and the not quite real worker. So this poses a massive challenge to anti-capitalists who have often relied on cohesive and clear conceptions of work, worker, and workplace in order to organize and mobilize. Big unions are struggling to integrate into their unionizing models the growing number of not quite and sometimes workers who are transient, who are politically disenfranchised and spatially dispersed. And following the spectacular failure of mainstream financial and governmental institutions to protect people's livelihoods in the lead up to and after the 2008 crisis, that carefully curated image of Silicon Valley capitalists as irreverent and innovative, along with that appeal of being your own boss rather than tied to these unreliable institutions, allows these platforms to become or like frame themselves as engines of economic populism. And under what many have called the entrepreneurial turn of post-2008 neoliberalism, capitalism has shifted from trying to break worker power to trying to abolish the formal category of worker altogether. So the future of anti-capitalist organizing must fully confront the fact that this trajectory where we all ascend into this unified industrial working class hasn't happened, and it won't happen. And capital is strategically undermining conceptual and spatial temporal boundaries around worker identity. What is considered work, what is not work, what the workplace is. So, you know, the question that so many are answering who are organizing now is, how do we conduct workplace organizing when there's no clear workplace? How do we defend and build worker power when so many have this very erratic and partial relationship to this category? And we can't afford to dismiss these questions as anomalous or just fringe, because this working model is being rolled out across so many different workforces. But luckily, we're not starting from scratch. Marxist feminist scholars and activists have engaged with the implications of not having one's work recognized as work, despite it being central to capital accumulation. Campaigns like Wages for Housework grappled with the contradictions and difficulties of organizing workers who are not considered and may not even consider themselves to be workers. Sex worker unions have had to organize in similar informalized conditions. Many sex workers consider themselves the original gig economy workers. And these kinds of campaigns have directly confronted the challenges that come with trying to carve out a cohesive logic of work, worker, and workplace, where these categories are not self-evident. In turn, there's a long history of quote unquote organizing the unorganizable in the global South amongst immigrant workers in metropolitan centers for whom precarity and informality have long been the norm. In critical disability studies and disability activism, the profound implications of being constructed as unproductive, quote unquote, under capital have been fleshed out and resisted. And these kinds of models are going to have to be central to understanding labor in the 21st century. And they must be revisited, reevaluated, and reconstructed as part of an anti-capitalist strategy. And you know, that imagined norm of the standard full-time permanent job was only ever a reality for a tiny portion of the world's workforce, yet it's often the assumed model that underpins our conception of the working class. And I'm going to wrap up really soon. As 20th century concepts of work and worker shift and splinter, that question of where next for anti-capitalists is an open one. Perhaps we attempt to recover and generalize these definitions. Perhaps we marshal the next crisis into fighting for a post-work future. But most likely, we're going to have to find some way of reconciling the two. And moreover, the coronavirus crisis has made clear that the principle of universalism must be revived and centered in everything we do. Elif started this conversation with that question of international solidarity. And it's worth saying that capitalism has this very funny way of making us feel insurmountably different and distant, while secretly making us more connected and dependent on each other than ever before. And times of crisis revealed this brutal unevenness in how capital is experienced, and the implications of falling outside of categories that confer some safety and dignity, like citizen or employee, and the racialized agendas and ableist processes that police these categories become starker than ever before.
Thanks so much, Dalia. That covered so much ground and really set the scene for our discussion. So thanks so much, Vijay. I'm going to bring you in now.
Right. Well, it's great to be here. As you know, I mean, LFU said the world is a hideous place. On the one side, we've got what's happening in Colombia. On the other side, we have Palestine. You know, the media can't even say the word Palestine. They just can say Gaza, and they can't say Palestinians. They can only say Hamas. You know, it's they choke on the word Palestine. It's difficult. It's in the same way, I suppose, they choke on the word human being or humanity. They just can't do it. It's hard for presenters on television programs to just say these words. Well, I have to say that two of you, Amelia and Dalia, have covered everything. So my temptation is just to make some observations. But Gargi, you know that I was going to make some observations anyway and not present anything coherent. So here it is. Let me take advantage of their coherence to be a little meandering. You know, I tried my best to read some of the literature some years ago about post-work. You know, there was a literature. You see, I understood the post-industrial society literature, and that's an older literature going back to the 70s and 80s. I understood that. It's true that in the advanced capitalist countries, there was deindustrialization. Industrial jobs went overseas, and I have some statistics about that. It's true that if you looked at, say, the United States, Canada, and so on, something in the character of the urban life and even suburban life became post-industrial. The character, you know, you can't read Charles Dickens' Hard Times and recognize that today in a Midland city. You know, Sheffield, where's the factory that produced cutlery? You know, where is that? It's not there. Is something correct, I think, empirical, accurate about the phrase post-industrial society. But post-work struck me as trivial. It struck me as not only futurological or whatever, science fiction, but it seems absurd because there is no possibility of a post-work society. You know, we're going to work one way or the other, whether we increasingly take advantage of machines or we have more time for social lives and leisure as opposed to work life. Work is something that's part of being a human being. I mean, you know, it's just part of how humans relate to each other and to nature. You know, I've raised two children. I worked in raising those children. I don't envisage a post-work post-work means that you're an elite family and you hire domestic servants to take care of your kids. That's post-work, you know, in that sense. So I've always thought there's something trivial about the term post-work society. Now look today, there is an assumption that, oh, well, you know, there's a post-work thing or we've moved to the gig economy. It's a completely erroneous way to look at things because we know that the global proletariat just before the COVID crisis was at it's the largest absolute number ever. It's over 3 billion. This is the ILO figures. Over 3 billion. 84% of the factory or industrial workers work in the global south. 84% of them. 74% of service workers work in the global south. 74%. You know, so it's true that in the much smaller populated advanced capitalist societies, it's true that there has been a shrinkage in some of these kind of jobs, but that's not a global condition. So what one experiences in terms of the gig economy and so on, that's largely in the advanced capitalist countries and in enclaves in the global south, in enclaves. So in sections of Delhi, you know, in one or two neighborhoods of Delhi, the gig economy begins to predominate. But in the bulk of Delhi, Delhi is an industrial city. You know, you can't go walk 15 minutes in Delhi without striking some sort of factory, particularly in the outskirts and so on. It's a deeply industrial city, which is why when strikes takes place, it's in Delhi. It's not outside somewhere. You know, that deindustrialization is not a part of life. Now, industrialization is harsh, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the first thing I just want to make is the post-work thing doesn't strike me as particularly interesting, and also the idea that we can somehow construct a post-work imaginary for the immediate future is just not accurate. It's not accurate for the rest of the world. So I don't see that's a valuable or useful way to go. It's useful for certain people on the planet, but let's not, generalize it to everybody, to all of humanity. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, we should recognize immense gains in the struggle of workers, of humans, to fight against the terribleness of capitalism and its system. Every year I sit down and I go back and I read Capital, and this year I was struck by a section. This is in the chapter on machine. And, Marx has a way of making the point crisply, I thought, in this particular case. I just want to read you this bit because it's so powerful. He says, this is in the chapter on the machine. In England, women are still occasionally used instead of horses for hauling barges because the labor required to produce horses and machines is an accurately known quantity, while that required to maintain the women of the surplus population is beneath all calculation. That's an incredible observation by Marx. It's incredible because he's saying here that in some cases you substitute human beings for machines because human beings are cheaper than the machine. This is the case in much of the global south. I'm going to return to this point. But in England, you have advanced beyond that to some extent. Engels, reviewing Marx's work, said that history moves in zigs and zags. And I really think we need to inhabit that because we need to absorb the gains we've made. We mustn't have a negative attitude, to the system we live in, because a lot of the system has within it the gains of our ancestors in fighting to change things. And that's very important. Must never surrender that to the likes of Boris Johnson and so on. They don't command the system. The structure has within it the bones and the struggles of our people. We are also there. So that I want to just put that there. Let's have a zigzag attitude and not like a reverse gear or a too much progressive attitude. Everything is going great or everything is going downhill. There are some gains and some losses. And I would like to just bring that to the table, that we have a different idea of temporality, at least in terms of the way we perceive the conditions of life and labor. Marx also writes in the chapter on machines, he shows that the largest section of the British working class in the early 19th century were domestic servants, not industrial workers. This, and boy, I'm really getting into the book today. He says, he makes the calculation. He says, this is again in the chapter on machines. He says that, because factory or industrial work is so immensely productive, and he means productive of surplus value, which is a technical idea that so much wealth is produced out of the factory that there's this huge surplus. And he said that is what makes it possible to reproduce the ancient domestic slaves on a constantly expanding scale under the name of a servant class, including men servants, women servants, lackeys, etc. In the footnote, he says young servant girls in the houses of the London lower middle class are called little slavies, with a direct reference to enslavement. The point here is that, industrial sector continues to be superbly exploitative and produce a lot of surplus. And now we have not just a domestic service class that turns down your beds and cleans the grate and so on, but it's a service class that provides the workers for the gig economy, does a whole range of services, produces some application that comes and cleans your computer. You can get whatever it is, clean my computer. Some app comes and checks to see and gets rid of open programs and so on. You get services to deliver food to your house. These are just the same as the domestic servants of 19th century England. There's no change. It's just that the character of the service class has changed. Now you don't call them little slavies or whatever, but you have a migrant worker coming to you on some sort of moped or whatever it is, delivering your food, instead of having a kitchen in your basement where there's also migrants, that in that case from Ireland, cooking for a house in England. Now the migrant on the bike comes from Somalia or somewhere else. Very little of the character has changed, just of the structure has changed, even though the flavor of it looks different. We don't see this in the same way as it was just 100 years ago. It was identical. Okay, they don't sleep in your house now, they sleep outside, but that's a minor difference. In a sense, it's a minor difference. And let's remember that Uber Eats all these apps, often the worker doesn't get paid a salary, they only get paid in tips. So the condition may actually have deteriorated in that case. Okay, so we've established that there is, a complexity involved in this world of work, but there's also a productive side going on somewhere else. Factory labor is producing enormous surplus value. I'll come back to that, Gargi, because I just want to make a point about that. Before that, I said that the number uh, 3 billion is the industrial working class, largest it's ever been. There's been a huge deterioration, obviously, during the time of the pandemic. We now know that last year itself, workers lost the equivalent of 255 million jobs. The equivalent of that, I think it's a total undercount. It's a ILO number, and ILO works on surveys that go to industry, trade unions, and governments. It's a very, very low number. It's much higher than that. We know that because the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program calculates that between 1.5 and 2 billion people are hungry now. 1.5 and 2 billion people are hungry. Actually, that's a good indicator of underemployment, because income is not coming in, people are hungry. So it's not 255 million. I'm guessing it's half the world's population has suffered great catastrophic losses of income in this period. And income support is useless. No country has produced adequate income support except, I'll tell you, Vietnam. China has produced income support. Cuba has produced income support, and so on. But these countries that are run by capitalist liberal governments are useless. I mean, Rishi, I mean, that's a joke. These sort of income support schemes, I don't even know why we use the same words to describe them. It's a hallucination budget. It's not a real budget, it's a hallucination. But the point I want to make, which I hope we'll be able to talk about, is, Marx has, uh, in Capital, two forms by which surplus value is extracted. One, as we all know, is through the absolute surplus value, by lengthening the working day, by making the working day, in a sense, the place where labor power is seized of its capacities. The other one is by relative surplus value, where you mechanize the process, where every hour becomes more productive, and because of that, of course, it takes less time to make the money needed for you to consume, and so on, and that shrinks your ability. And that is, in fact, what industrialism does. It increases surplus value by this relative fashion, by creating. But there's a third form that Marx doesn't get into in Capital, and that's the suppression of the standard of living of people outside the advanced industrial zone. You'll travel to parts of India where you see the working class essentially eating a ball of grain, let's say millet, with water. It's a ball made of water and millet, which will be eaten in the break between things. They're essentially eating bread and water. There's no nutrients in that. And, in the capitalist country, you'll hear comments like, well, the standard of living is different because their sense of culture is different. It's a racist attitude to most of the world, that they don't need adequate wages because they don't know what to spend it on. They basically animalize the huge group of people. So the super exploitation of these people brings this vast surplus back to the advanced capitalist core. The levels at which super exploitation go on now is horrendous. So now let's think about those workers when we talk about the world of work. Let's think about those workers who are basically commuting 2-3 hours by train, bus, walking, and so on. They are often day laborers. They work in industry and in industrial fields. Day laborers, they have no time for any social life or leisure or anything like that. See, they are not looking for a post work world. They are not looking for post work. If you see what the people who organize amongst these sectors will tell you, it's not post work. They are looking for adequate nutrition. They are looking for adequate health care. They are looking for a social wage. They are looking for regular work, more work hours, things like that. So, in that sense, I would hope that we as socialists, as socialist intellectuals, don't jump over their demands. Let's not leap from their demands to futurology. I think we should advance to a better world, but from the standpoint of where actual existing workers are today. And the bulk of the workers are this. They are sitting in the corner of a factory, 4 or 5 of them together, eating a ball of grain and water, smoking a very cheap cigarette, and then going right back to work in a place where the lighting is bad. So their eyes are also going. That's where the actual existing working class in numbers lives. This doesn't negate the fact that there's a huge working class that sits at computers, answers calls, and all of that gig economy. Doesn't negate that they exist. But I think we should be careful not to allow our focus on the gig economy or that section of worker to eclipse the fact that the industrial worker is still sitting there. They just don't look like the characters from the early 20th century advanced industrial or capitalist world. They look different. They look like peasants. They are much thinner. They are underfed. They get sick quickly. They die easily. This is worse than Charles Dickens' Hard Times. Dickens could not have imagined what some of these industrial zones look like, where entire families are scrounging in the tailing dam in southern Congo, trying to extract cobalt so that batteries can be built. They are part of the industrial working class. They are so-called artisan miners. The healthcare workers in India are called volunteers. I mean, this is where we are. This is where we are.
Thanks so much, Vijay. And I'd like to talk about who and where the industrial working class are now. I'm going to say something because I wonder if we're kind of talking past each other a bit. But I guess this is our location. When you talk about industrial labour force in the global south who are basically day labourers, I think of that as part of the gig economy, because the gig economy is the breaking of the contract of employment. It's not whether I have a green sticker on my back or if I courier. It's about the the employer refusing to acknowledge that you are my worker, even though every day I know you cannot eat unless you come and do what I say. So I think there's a kind of continuity between some of what Dalia was saying and what you're saying, and the kind of different, they're kind of parallels rather than in opposition of how to talk. My first question, kind of, you all talked about it a bit already, but maybe I'll say it again. And we know that and I guess this also comes from who is the industrial worker, that many of us, and I'm including our comrades who are kind of have to work today to eat today across the world, do work in increasingly precarious and fragmented ways. That makes it, if I don't know if I will have that work tomorrow, if I'm not a sufficiently subservient worker, and if I don't know if this will be where I do my day labour today or where I do my gigging tomorrow, that has some consequences for how we think about worker organisation. I absolutely hear what's being said by different speakers about what the demand is. And I said a bit at the beginning, demands which seem so far from the big vision of dismantling capitalism. Could I eat twice today? That kind of level. Could I make enough to make rent? But the demand is only one bit. The other bit is, well, what is it to organise? And I wondered if this is, I'm starting with the miserable ones. I know I have some more upbeat ones later, but what does that fragmentation of work and the real immiseration of workers around the world mean to how we might think of building and organising anti-capitalist resistance through the work? Even how we kind of pull the question along a bit, because we have, I think, as the global left, often still assumed that work might be terrible, but we know where it is and we know how we'll organise there. And both those things, I think, are being churned for us willfully, aren't they? Does that make sense? Does anyone want to say something? Does that mean you'd speak, Dalia? You're smiling. Is it just being kind to me?
I think Amelia put her hand up first, so I'll let her go first.
Thank you. I guess one way to approach the problem, and this is a completely partial answer that works more theoretically than practically. The one thing we can do is move this question of, I guess, the problem with the way in which the notion of the industrial worker has been carried across, there's two, right? One is whether it remains accurate, and we can say no. The other is the kind of moral thickness that I mean, I guess what I'm talking about is this mythic kind of Fordist male factory worker in blue overalls, like, you know, like Lana Del Rey levels of like historical kind of accuracy there. But like, there's two problems there. There's one is this model still tracking like actually existing work? And the other is like, what have we kind of morally attached to that figure? Because there's a kind of thick attachment to this vision, and I think we need to move away from those. And one way to move away is think, well, what defines the state of being proletarian? Is it the work you do? Well, no, because a huge number of activities fall into that, right? Some of that looks like that industrial mass factory work. Some of that looks like little pockets, little piecemeal bits of piecework, right? Of service work in that kind of way, right? So what do? We can move from that moment of the working itself to this prior state of dispossession. The fact that you are dependent on the market, the fact that you have to work. Where that takes us practically is a different question, but I think theoretically that can answer some of those worries, right? As we move from this mythic model, which is constraining, I think, politically and empirically, and we go back to that moment of dispossession. What that might look like in terms of practical organizing might be highly local, I guess. Yeah.
I think so. I think I can answer the what you said, Gargi, first. I think that in both my own work and both my own research, like, I'm increasingly finding that when you have this idea of like, okay, for so many people where there's no stable workplace, so a lot of the kind of like side interactions and the like, you know, when I think about like how taxi driving has changed, it's like before you had like the mini cab office where everyone, like a lot of time was actually spent at that mini cab office, where just like lots of time waiting for work, where lots of conversations and like friendships and relationships can get formed, and you have someone who's working in their local mini cab office for like years and years and years. What I'm finding increasingly is that because the organizing is still happening. I mean, in London, in the UK, Uber drivers won worker status. That happened through organizing. It's through actually like cultural and social spaces that have not previously been considered part of what relevant to workplace organizing. It's been the mosque, it's been the different cultural centers, it's been like network, it's been the street, it's been like Deliveroo riders like waiting outside of like dark kitchens, or it's been, you know, near Heathrow Airport, and it's been these kinds of, which is still very transient spaces, because like you'll go to Heathrow Airport one day and you'll see like a group of people, and then you'll go a week later and like people make their decisions on the cuff, like where they're going to work and what they're going to do on that day. And so, but I'm increasingly finding that those are actually, it's like those transient moments on the street where people, like the nannies, for example, a lot of childcare workers, it's like waiting for, you know, like after like stay and plays and things like that, and like conversations that kind of, so it's like in the street, these kind of like moments where we like they cross each other, or it's in those spaces that have been previously seen as like the domain of culture and therefore not serious economics, which is obviously like silly, but you know, in that kind of, those kind of cultural spaces. And I also think that, you know, one of the points, and you know, this is a very highly localized question, but like one of the points about, you know, what makes up the working class is, I think the point that we have to grapple with is this idea that there are working classes, there isn't a working class, there's no singular definition or experience of the working class. Two people in different parts of the world can be part of the working class for opposing reasons. So for example, you can have one person who is part of the working class because they are being exploited to the bone at a workplace and working endless hours. And you can have someone who's part of the working class because they're not able to get access to work, and by virtue of that are either relying on paltry handouts from the state or relying on unstable social networks to keep themselves alive between jobs or between gigs. And I think that being able to come up with a language that can encompass both of those things is part of our struggle, and it's part of our way of creating connections between those two things, because both are suffering in different ways, right? And I think that the question about post-work raises really important things, because I think no serious, and I have to say that I don't come from a particular tradition here, I'm still very much learning and reading and, you know, trying to think through, but from what I've understood, the language, like the idea that no one serious believes that machines can replace workers. Even if we were to have machines to replace every form of work, which would be impossible, we'd still need workers to maintain the machines, right? So that, I don't think anyone serious believes that. What I get from it is this question of, and I think that you raise it and it's really interesting, is there has been a shift, right, in the demand being for a big demand of trade unions being, you know, for less work, for higher wages, for, you know, and now it's coming to more work. And I think that question of having more time, free time, as it were, and not having to have what work we do led by the demands of an insatiable need for endless growth and endless consumerism, but also having this idea that I shouldn't have to work 12-hour days in order to be able to feed myself and house myself. And so that being the condition of the demand when we say less work. I still do think that the demand should be less work. That's one thing I can say is absolutely a conviction that I can stand behind. And perhaps that is a different conversation in a different context, and that's a conversation that we need to have. But I think we all do agree that you shouldn't have to work hours and hours and hours in backbreaking work in order to stay alive and have your basic needs met. I think we can agree on that. And that for me is what the question of, you know, that's what can be gleaned as interesting from some of the post-work thinking, rather than this idea that machines can do everything, because I don't think anyone with any kind of serious disposition would actually argue that. But yeah.
Okay. You know, I think that there's a lot to be gained from going back and reading Marx, because I think there's a lot lost in the way we think about work. You know, there are working conditions, you know, and those are variegated and there's a range of them and so on. But the division line for me is between, well, what was Marx's project? You know, he was trying to understand, where does wealth come from? You know, it's a little bit, it's a critique of Smith and Ricardo and others. And what he found was he had to divide two kinds of work. One was productive, one was unproductive. This was not a moral statement when he said productive and unproductive. He wasn't using it morally. He was talking about where surplus value comes from. And the general argument is that surplus value comes from productive work, which is work which is done that produces commodities. And that's productive work. Then there's a huge surplus, and then society sort of distributes the surplus. And that's where your service sector comes in. And many of these other jobs are in the service sector, where surplus is distributed. So the key area for a Marxist or somebody on the left is to see, well, how does one organize the productive workers? And I think that's what I'm mainly interested in our conversation, is that, you know, when we look at the situation of where surplus value is being extracted from, even those who do the statistical analysis see that the vast bulk of it comes from the global south. That's where the vast bulk of that form of the rate of surplus value, it comes from there. You know, we did a study at Tricontinental on the exploitation of iPhone workers. And we found that if the iPhone was all built, 100% built in the United States, it would cost $30,000 for each iPhone. 30,000, you know, just for one iPhone. Instead, it retails at an extraordinarily discount price of 200 and some dollars, $300, let's say. Well, who's paying the difference? And that's the productive worker. The productive worker is subsidizing essentially an iPhone at a level where people in the West can afford it. And somebody is paying the cost of bringing it down to $300. Now, having established that, we can ask, what are the working conditions? What are the life conditions, and so on? The principal problem is that capital has become so powerful. It's been able to organize people in a way where their own self-organizing becomes difficult. And I don't know if I'm comfortable using the term gig economy to describe the level of harshness inflicted on those workers, because I don't think it really works. When you visit some of these places where workers are out there extracting cobalt from the tailing mine, I don't think that the term gig economy captures it. It maybe even in some senses minimizes the kind of harshness of the work they have to do. Because these are people who are working like half the day, if not more. We've got to find a word that actually conveys, culturally conveys the harshness of that work. Simply because they are day workers doesn't mean that it's the same kind of work. Now, the point I want to make about that is precisely about because the unionization is weak at that end of the global economy, capital has indeed been greatly advantaged. That it's fine, if one unionizes a service sector job, does it really inflict pain on capital? At what level? Maybe transportation jobs can inflict pain on capital. So, for instance, port jobs, or maybe even delivery jobs, or those who manage databases can inflict pain on capital. But other employees, because there's a surplus of us, you start to organize, they fire you. As some of you know on this call, you will be cashiered in a second because they have surplus reserve army waiting right behind you. It's in the productive sector where used to be the workers had to have a certain skill, and because they had a certain skill, they were not so easy to replace. If you're going to manage machines and so on, you had to have a skill. They were not easy to replace. Now they've de-skilled so much of the production of commodities, they've de-skilled it so greatly that it's much easier to replace people. Not only that, because the actual factory sizes have shrunk, the capital investment per factory is much less. So it's easier to lock the factory, throw away the key, and start somewhere else, because your investment footprint is so much less. So you travel outside Dhaka in Bangladesh, you travel outside Dhaka and you look at the garment factories. Essentially, the garment factories, it's a lot like the 19th century. These are tiny little apartments almost, where they have, sewing machines in a row, and they'll bring in, 50 women to sit there. There's no way to take a break or anything. They're in a row of sewing machines. The noise is extraordinary. There's poor lighting. It's literally like a 19th century workshop. It's not a factory. It's almost like we've gone from the kind of workshop manufacturing to industrial large-scale factories back to workshopping. And that makes it hard to organize because you don't have the density. People complain in the United States, union density is down to, I think, 10.5 to 11%, which is, I think, a historic low. Maybe it's just a little lower than that. But in place like Bangladesh, union density is below the floor, guys. It's really low. So the point about looking at these things is what is the organizing possibilities in the production sector, and how much pain can one inflict on the capitalist class in order to actually have political power to change the relations. And that is just there. I think we are in a position of great bleakness. And by the way, just quickly, if I don't, this is despite the fact that last year on the 26th of November, 250 million workers in India went on a strike. I'm saying this to you despite that, despite having covered that and seen that most of those workers were informal sector workers. India, technically 93% of the workforce is informal sector. So 250 million workers were on strike. Despite that, I'm telling you that the possibility to inflict real pain on capitalism is minimal today.
Yeah, and and that, and the bleakness was in my question as well, because that is the point. The point is, of course, it's partly our language of what our commonality or connections are, but that's only one small component. The project of naming the proletariat is only in order to wield our collective power. And so we're on that journey, aren't we? We've got a really interesting, a few really interesting questions from the audience, which are also about scale. And I also am interested in this demasification of labor, because again, part of our techniques globally as people who, as in worker organization, is a kind of assumption that capital will seek to massify the labor force, because that's good for capital in lots of ways. And yet we're living through all kinds of demassification and fragmentation. Now, this is about very different kinds of sector, but a couple of points from the audience, which we'll try and put together in one question. About one person saying that they usually work in small independent businesses and are often told they're part of the family, have sold that lie of being part of the family. And it doesn't work on them, but it makes it very difficult to organize with their fellow workers, because any small suggestion for organizing, so they're saying, have we got any ideas about how you organize in those very small scale workplaces where the relations between owners, managers and workers are so close and personal? And I think that's a bit linked to this idea of the demassification of the workplace. And linked to that, this is kind of a global north question, but I think actually not only. That someone else saying that they work for a charity and they're almost guilt-tripped into overworking because their work is for the greater good, which I think is very close to things Amelia was talking about as if it's a mission, as if, it's your fulfillment to do that. And could anyone expand on exploitation in that kind of context, that kind of not only be grateful to have a job, but to have a great meaningful job, how you might resist there? So I think there's one about the demassification of work and the kind of pretense that work is a familial relation, which I think that's everywhere, and all certainly in the productive sector, but all across services as well. And the other one is about moral impetus of kinds of work. And you don't all have to answer both bits, but if you want to answer both or either, that would all be great. Anyone want to go first? Yeah, Amelia, thanks so much.
On that, those are both really fascinating questions, and there's not easy answers, unfortunately. The guilt trip one, I think, is a really fascinating puzzle, because there is a very persuasive line which goes something like this: it's going to be easier in some ways to organize workers in the bits of the service sector which have kind of public facing elements and which are seen as caring. So like nursing, teaching, universities. And to some extent, this is true because you can link up with communities, but there's a way in which that works really well for big disputes, right? Like nurses go on strike, everyone has an intuitive feeling that like nursing work matters. And there's a lot you kind of appeal to. There's a certain political and moral authority that comes from that. But on a day-to-day basis, when there's interactions, and I think this holds true for the charity sector too, and it really happens in academic work a lot, is that your sense of duty becomes one of the things that management use against you. A lot of academics will worry about going on strike because they're worried about the effects it will have on their students. And one of these kind of invisible metrics you have in your mind, and this is worse in a really marketized version of higher education, is that one of the things that will be used to score you are these student feedback things, right? These students feedback surveys. So you have this kind of emotional pull on the other side, and then you have this metricized version of that emotional pull, and that manipulation is incredibly strong. I think it comes back to this fantastic point made earlier about just doing your job, right? And having that as a really firm line, being lazy, working to your contract, like not doing everything. And this is hard. This is really hard and requires coordination. It's something that happens in academia a lot, and I think in careers which are seen as like careers, right, or vocations, where you have to scramble around for a tiny number of jobs. But you see it in So for example, for my teaching work, we're paid like, if you actually spent the time it took to prepare the stuff, you'd be paid like less than minimum wage. And some people's response to this is to try and like do as little as possible while still doing a decent enough job. Whereas you know that some people are like working a huge amount for free basically, and making these things which are kind of superfluous, which aren't required to get the job done. So like, I don't know, like special color coded wall charts for students, and resisting this kind of extra stuff and saying like no, and seeing that kind of stuff is in some ways like akin to scabbing, right? Like, why are you doing this extra work? You're making it harder for everyone. And talking to your colleagues about that can help. On the small workplace and the kind of myth of the family, that is really, really, really hard, because that's one of those situations where getting involved in a union, unionizing your workforce in those small kind of like little independent family workplaces, whatever, is seen as this big escalation. So I don't think I can give advice without knowing the details of that. It's quite hard. It is really, really, really hard to do, because you're made to feel like when you have like a genuinely close relationship, because it is a small workplace, you know that person, that can be really effectively used against you. So it is really complicated. I wouldn't want to give advice without knowing the particulars, but I think as always it is getting all the other people who work there together, finding out what those issues are, finding out what those gripes are, and trying to politicize around them, starting with that stuff of everyday life.
Yeah, I think that in a sense there's so this is where I think we have a lot to learn from Marxist feminist struggles, of like where literally you are trying to where like we've had and I raised the example of Wages for Housework campaign, where you had literally a labor struggle within an actual family that is actually not a metaphor, not a metaphorical family, but how to push through that kind of sense of like, even if I do feel these affective bonds to my work for whatever reason, because I'm caring for a child, you know, I'm a nanny or I'm a babysitter, or, you know, and I actually do, like, you know, it's not as easy to just be like, oh, I don't care. But how to actually reconcile those two things. And that's where we can look at that history and how kind of that, and Federici talks often about how that campaign was about bringing to head a set of contradictions and having particular conversations, rather than, you know, trying to have an actual, like, rather than actually, like, it wasn't like a policy proposal. It wasn't policy work. It was campaigning, you know, organizing, conshiousness raising work, which is much more exciting. And I think that in my own work, I think that this has also really come through and when I talk about how like a lot of the models that are being developed in these kind of like platform work sectors is like this sense of like being constantly rated, and this like automated rating system, which is something that we're all finding in our, like a lot of us who aren't necessarily tethered to an app are finding in our areas of work, which then pushes you in order. So a lot of drivers that I speak to, for example, like, you know, contractually, what I'm paid to do is get someone from A to B. That's my job, right? But because of this rating system, because I am my own boss, quote unquote, because of all of, and also all of this very enticing and attractive messaging, and the way that the app, the way that the entire thing is designed is to appeal to this sense of I'm my own boss and I'm an entrepreneur. You suddenly have all of this immaterial work of like putting water bottles in their car, putting, you know, different kinds of like scents, and, you know, having different like smells and different, you know, having sort of sussing, you know, they'll talk about how they suss out what kinds of conversations to have, whether or not to have a conversation. So all these kinds of like added bits where it's like, okay, actually, this is all stuff that I worry about and I'm getting paid and I'm, you know, doing, and is becoming an expectation, and is upon which the model and the reputation of the company that is allegedly not my employer relies upon in order for people to sign up to it, in order for it to generate value. But it's not spoken, it's unspoken, it's not written down, it's engineered through these like algorithmic nudges, which is why I think that like when it comes to that question of, you know, what role is technology having in work, I think that there's two things, right? There's, first of all, this idea that just because it's technology, it's not extractive or it doesn't require physical work is wrong. You know, even if you look at the fact that the technology, that the material stuff that is necessary for like a phone relies on like mining and, you know, extractive physical material labor, but also that I feel like I spend a lot of time in sort of technology circles being like, nothing's really changed. This is just labor exploitation repackaged. And a lot of time in like labor and political economy spaces being like, actually, there is something about technology that is quite specific in how it organizes work. And part of that is like creating these algorithmic nudges, which generate particular patterns of behavior that are not actually coming from a boss, but is actually being engendered into sort of like, you know, companies like Uber will employ behavioral psychologists in their algorithmic design in order to create ways of making people feel addicted. You know, a lot of workers describe an addiction to the kind of like reaching a certain number of gigs in a day and doing it in a particular way and having a particular rating system and doing it in a particular time, and where you have these apps where like there's no way for, like, they preclude the communication between workers through the apps other than in the form of competition, other than in the form of, in your area, this number of workers have achieved this amount, this is where you rank in that. So that kind of like the way that the algorithmic management has managed to manifest control that is separable, that is appears separated and is concealed by this idea of it being a technology company and things like that, that is actually quite different. And it changes. And when we talk about the reason it's important is not because it's radically different from what has existed before, but because it comes through when you talk to the people who are doing this work. It comes through in how they conceptualize who they are, what they're doing, and who their boss is. And that's important when it comes to building organizing models that are going to capture this workforce that is currently just not being captured by traditional union organizing. Like, it's just not. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, you know, a lot of the things that we're talking about, of course, in this section is about labor disciplining and different forms of labor disciplining. You know, when you say work to rule, which is just do the minimum, I mean, that's basically the class struggle, because the class struggle is between working to rule and then super exploitation. It's the range. So, I mean, all workers struggle to work to rule, but it's not easy because there are ways in which you are disciplined. You are fired, you are punished, your wages are cut, or you're made to feel guilty. I mean, everything we've talked about has been the range for over 100 years of workplace management. I wanted to just add one more management thing, which is migrant workers or migrancy, and how countries are disciplined. The labor forces in countries are disciplined. I'll give you an example. Jamaica has been under IMF pressure off and on. They were able to get out of IMF pressure, then they're back in. The IMF told Jamaica, you have to maintain your public sector wages at 9%. This is very important. Jamaica has an incredibly good public education system, and it produces quite skilled workforces out of this. I mean, I'm talking crudely. It produces human beings, citizens, and all that. But for the purpose of this story, it produces very skilled workers. Many of these workers go into things like nursing. I'm just taking that example. But because Jamaica, by IMF pressures, held down to maintain public sector wages at 9%, they can't pay nurses what other countries can pay. And guess what? Two of the biggest shareholders in the IMF, who put a lot of pressure on IMF policy, the United States and the UK, advertise in Jamaican newspapers for nurses. So I remember seeing in Jamaican newspapers the National Health Service. Okay, I admit within the UK it's a great institution, whatever, but it's totally imperialist because it goes to Jamaica, takes advantage of an artificial suppression of nursing wages for public sector hospitals in Jamaica and poaches nurses to come to the UK and to the US to work in your hospitals. Now you get migrants to come and do these jobs. They are disciplined by migrancy, because it's harder for you then to stand up and fight with your bosses. Not saying migrants don't, and migrants have led some of the most fierce organizing drives. So don't misunderstand me. But it is harder because you have so much pressure of having come far away and so on. I mean, the imperialist structure is alive and well, in this. And in the middle of a pandemic, when people salute essential workers, well, you can salute essential workers as much as you want, but they may not want to be your essential workers. They may have wanted to work in a hospital in Jamaica, but you've in fact forced them to come to the UK because you forced the Jamaican government to hold down public sector wages. I mean, think about how labor discipline operates in the International Division of Labor today. How different is it from 200 years ago? I'm not sure. I know people always feel like, well, things have changed a lot because it looks like it's changed. I don't know. Sometimes structurally things are quite similar, and it's worth tending sometimes to the structure a little bit, even if the surface looks so very different. In this case, the structure doesn't look that different. The workers that came in Windrush, for instance, and then came and drove the buses and built Britain's infrastructure after the war. This is another generation of workers coming in the same sort of boats, and they are being treated the same way as the Windrush generation. These workers who come to work in the NHS, and then you can bang as many pots as you want and you can cheer them as much as you want, but they still maybe want to work in their own hospitals in their own country. And I'm not saying this in a xenophobic way, guys, like go home and do. I'm totally the opposite of that. But let's hear what they want. They have come under compulsion. Is that such a good way for people to live with their sense of, oh, we have these superb nurses, we have the greatest NHS? The imperialist NHS. It's not the National Health Service, it's still the Imperial Health Service.
Wow. I mean, what a note to end on. Thank you very much. Vijay, Dalia, Amelia, of course, Gagi, as always, for this incredible discussion. I mean, actually, like many of the discussions we have, it could go on for hours and we would still need more hours. But I guess what's one of the points of doing our events in the way we do them is to also encourage people to go and read and and inspire them to hopefully want to know more and want to learn more, and even crucially what they learn to also inspire them to put that into action. So again, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Just a few closing notes. If you like this event, please visit leftbookclub.com, and if you want to become a member, just click Become a Member tab. Follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're still watching this tonight. And also just a very quick reminder that until the end of May, particularly to celebrate Radical May, but also 150 years of Rosa Luxemburg, with every new subscription, we are giving away a free copy of Rosa Luxemburg's Socialism or Barbarism. So if you become a member before the end of May, you'll get a free copy of the Rosa Luxemburg book that we published earlier this year. And our next event is on the 27th of May at 7 p.m. UK time. And it's an event discussing our book of the month last month, so of April, The Unknowers, How Strategic Ignorance Rules the World by Lindsay McGoey. And we will have Lindsay McGoey, the author, Emily Kenway, Loki, and Joe Littler discussing the book. And you can register for tickets on our Eventbrite, and the links will be on our social media. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and I hope you have either a good evening or a good day wherever you are. Thank you.